Hello, friends. We are on chapter 28, An Unfortunate Lily Maid. Ooh, let's check the volume. Of course you must be Elaine, Anne, said Diana. I could never have the courage to float down there. Nor I, said Ruby Gillis with a shiver. I don't mind floating down when there's 2 or 3 of us in the flat and we can sit up. It's fun then, but to lie down and pretend I was dead? I just couldn't. I'd die, really, of fright. Of course it would be romantic, conceded Jane Andrews, but I don't. But I. But I know I couldn't keep still. I'd be popping up every minute or so to see where I was. And if I wasn't drifting too far out, and you know, Anne, that would spoil the effect. But it's so ridiculous to have a red-headed Elaine, mourned Anne. I'm not afraid to float down, and I'd love to be Elaine, but it's ridiculous just the same. Ruby ought to be Elaine because she's so fair and has such lovely long golden hair. Elaine had all her bright hair streaming down, you know, and Elaine was the lily maid. Now, a red-haired person cannot be a lily maid. Your complexion is just as fair as Ruby, said Diana earnestly, and your hair is ever so much darker than it used to be before you cut it. Oh, do you really think so? Exclaimed Anne, flushing sensitively with delight. I've sometimes thought it was myself, but I never dared to ask anyone for fear she would tell me it wasn't. Do you think it could be called auburn now, Diana? Yes, and I think it's real pretty, said Diana, looking admiringly at the short, silky curls that clustered over Anne's head and were held in place by a very jaunty black velvet ribbon and bow. They were standing on the bank of the pond below Orchard Slope, where a little headland fringed with birches ran out from the bank. At its tip was a small wooden platform built onto the water for the convenience of the fishermen and duck hunters. Ruby and Jane were spending the midsummer afternoon with Diana, and Anne had come over to play with them. Anne and Diana had spent most of their playtime that summer on and about the pond. Idlewild was a thing of the past, Mr. Bell having ruthlessly cut down the little circle of trees in his back pasture in the spring. Anne had sat among the stumps and wept, not without an eye to the romance of it all, but she was speedily consoled, for after all, as she and Diana said, big girls of 13 going on 14 were too old for such childish amusements as playhouses, and there were more fascinating sports to be found about the pond. It was splendid to fish for trout over the bridge, and the 2 girls learned to row themselves about in the little flat-bottomed dory Mr. Barry kept for duck shooting. It was Anne's idea that they dramatize Elaine. They had studied Tennyson's poem in school the preceding winter, the superintendent of education having prescribed it in the English course for the Prince Edward Island schools. They had analyzed and parsed it and torn it to pieces in general until it was a wonder there was any meaning at all left in it for them. But at least the fair Lily Maid and Lancelot and Guinevere and King Arthur had become very real people to them, and Anne was devoured by secret regret that she had not been born in Camelot. Those days, she said, were so much more romantic than the present. Anne's plan was hailed with enthusiasm. The girls had discovered that if the flat were pushed off from the landing place, it would drift down with the current under the bridge and finally strand itself on another headland lower down, which ran out in a curve in the pond. They had often gone down like this, and nothing could be more convenient for playing Elaine. Well, I'll be Elaine, said Anne, yielding reluctantly, for although she would have been delighted to play the principal character, yet her artistic sense demanded fitness for it, and this, she felt, her limitations made impossible. Ruby, you must be King Arthur. Jane will be Guinevere, and Diana must be Lancelot. But first you must be the brothers and the father. We can't have the dumb old servitor because there isn't room for two in the flat when one is lying down. We must paw the barge all its length in blackest samite. That old black shawl of your mother's will be just the thing, Diana. The black shawl having been procured, Anne spread it over the flat and then lay down on the bottom with closed eyes and hands folded over her breast. "Oh, she really does look dead," whispered Ruby Gillis nervously, watching the still white little face under the flickering shadows of the birches. "It makes me feel frightened, girls. Do you suppose it's really right to act like this? Mrs. Lynde says that all that play acting is abominably wicked." "Ruby, you shouldn't talk about Mrs. Lynde," said Anne severely. "It spoils the effect, because this is hundreds of years before Mrs. Lynde was born. Jane, you arrange this. It's silly for Elaine to be talking when she's dead." Jane rose to the occasion. Cloths of gold for coverlet there was none, but an old piano scarf of yellow Japanese crepe was an excellent substitute. A white lily was not obtainable just then, but the effect of a tall blue iris placed in one of Anne's folded hands was all that could be desired. "Now she's all ready," said Jane. "We must kiss the quiet brows. And Diana, you say, 'Sister, farewell forever.' And Ruby, you say, 'Farewell, sweet sister,' both of you as sorrowfully as you possibly can. And for goodness sake, smile a little. You know Elaine lay as though she smiled. That's better. Now push the flat off." The flat was accordingly pushed off, scraping roughly over an embedded stake in the process. Diana and Jane and Ruby only waited long enough to see it caught in the current and headed for the bridge before scampering up through the woods, across the road and down to the lower headland where, as Lancelot and Guinevere and the king, they were to be in readiness to receive the Lily Maid. For a few minutes, Anne, drifting slowly down, enjoyed the romance of her situation to the full, for something happened not at all romantic. The flat began to leak. In a very few moments it was necessary for Elaine to scramble to her feet, pick up her cloth of gold coverlet and pile of blackest samite, and gaze blankly at a big crack in the bottom of her barge, through which water was literally pouring. That sharp stake at the landing had torn off the strip of batting nailed on the flat. Anne did not know this, but it did not take her long to realize the flat would fill and sink long before it could drift to the lower headland. Where were the oars left behind at the landing? Anne gave one gasping little scream, which nobody even heard. She was white to the lips, but she did not lose her self-possession. There was one chance, just one. "I was horribly frightened," she told Mrs. Allen the next day. And it seemed like years while the flat was drifting down to the bridge and the water rising in at every moment. I prayed, Mrs. Allen, most earnestly, but I didn't shut my eyes to pray, for I knew the only way God could save me was to let the flat float close enough to one of the bridge piles for me to climb up on. You know, the piles are just old tree trunks, and there are lots of them. There are lots of knots and old branch stumps on them. It was proper to pray, but I had to do my part by watching out, and right well I knew it. I just said, 'Dear God, please take the flat close to a pile and I'll do the rest,' over and over again. Under such circumstances, you don't think much about making a flowery prayer, but mine was answered, for the flat bumped right into a pile for a minute, and I flung the scarf and shawl over my shoulder and scrambled up on the big providential stub. And there I was, Mrs. Allen, clinging to the slippery old pile with no way of getting up or down. It was a very unromantic position, but I didn't think about that at the time. You don't think much about romance when you have just escaped from a watery grave. I said a grateful prayer at once, and then I gave all my attention to holding on tight, for I know I should probably have to depend on human aid to get back to dry land. Whew, Lord, y'all, I'm sleepy again. I must stop there, but I hope, golly, I've only been on 11 minutes. I'll try to come back today and finish up. I'm sorry. I need a nap. Love you guys. I'll be on 3 today. Don't forget, light tea at 3. Okay, be sweet. Don't be ugly. Love ya.